So there's that seam, and you can see that it's not a fracture, which breaks apart. Fractures break apart. This is a seam that joins together. And then we'll just move along this concrete step created by the ancients as part of their terraforming project. And look for another seam, because they built from left to right in sections. And here's another seam. So please note, this is not a fracture breaking apart, natural geology, but a seam joining together artificial concrete. So we see again the seam joining together the sections that they laid down as they moved left to right. They always went hard, soft, hard, soft. So as this layer, this hard layer ends, we come to a softer, chalky layer, right? Which is the earthquake mitigation layer. Then you've got the hard layer, right? Super hard concrete. Then the soft, chalky, more eroded layer, because the soft layer will erode more. So the chalky layers are always indented, and you can see that really clearly, right? And then you've got the chalky stuff crumbling out everywhere. So that's how they built their hills. Now we're going to move down to end of Geology Creek, where we've done quite a bit of exploration. It's right down there. And I want to show you something that I missed on a previous exploration. So we're here down in the bottom of the creek bed, and I just wanted to show you this diagonal seam. We had taken note of the seams in previous videos, but I didn't mention or notice that they were diagonal, because I noticed the diagonal quality of the seams here in Texas later on. So the flow of the river is there. We could also call it the line between the hills, but it's the flow of the river, and the seams between the sections, or marking the sections, are diagonal to the flow, approximate 45. So it's interesting, very interesting, and we can see that even more clearly on the other side, and we'll continue to explore the angle of these seams. So you can see the diagonal nature. It's an approximate 45. There's that seam, and by the way, this seam runs through many different, quote, eons or eras of material, right? The geologist would say that this is one era, that's one era, right? But this line runs through all those and the next. So we can't say that that's geology. It's impossible. Let's look for more diagonal seamage. Here's another diagonal seam. Now that piece is out. That's broken out because presumably at the seams we have a weaker building than throughout each section. But here's the flow of the river. Well, let's just say here's the flow of the river, right? And there's your 45, approximate 45 to the flow, or to the line between the hills. So as we go along, we don't notice any obvious seams for quite a while. One long left to right section, and then we see this seam, which is also a diagonal, but it's going the opposite way. Pretty interesting, right? Pretty darned interesting. So they're opposing diagonals, and then it continues on with that same opposing diagonal seamage. And you can see how the seam, which is broken apart over years, it's not a fracture, it's a broken seam. You can see how that transverses different, quote, geological eras. So this layer above starts here, right? So we have this layer, right? And there's where that layer ends. But this seam transverses both of those layers and then transverses the next layer, right? So we know that that can't be geology. It must be building. That's an unarguable point, which has been made in several Terraforming of Terra videos. The university is unable to deal with new information. It's a very, very dangerous place for students. Now this diagonal seam, and again at a 45 to the flow of the river, okay, so there's the flow of the river or the creek. This is an approximate 45 to that flow. And you can see how it transverses many different, quote, sedimentary layers or geological eras. How does it do that? There's one where one layer ends, another begins, but that seam, which is breaking out, transverses that, then it transverses the next set of layers. So we know that that's building, and they built this section from bottom to top. They said we're going to put some soft earthquake mitigating chalky stuff here, then a harder layer, okay, then a tiny layer of soft earthquake mitigating chalky, right, harder layer, chalky again, soft, little tiny soft chalky layer, okay, harder layer. So that's many, many, many layers, and then they just ended it on the left right there. Okay, here's another diagonal seam at approximate 45 to the flow of the river, even more clear in this bottom layer. So we've got this, and then the flow of the river, where the creek is there, and you've got your diagonal seam there. And that 45 is an opposing 45-degree angle to the original ones we found a little further upstream. Really interesting. But let's see how far this... Watch this thing go through different, quote, sedimentary layers. Watch it go. And notice the smoothness of this, the constructedness of it. And it disappears right here, okay? It's so integral, it's so strong, but reappears there. Okay, broken out so we can see the interior face, not Grecian statue smooth, but obviously constructed, because there's no reason for something to have this feel, this flattish feel, not perfectly flat, if it were natural geology. Fractures would not take that nature. And then we have next to it another seam going through the artificial material, and it continues on, and you can see the flattish edges of the seam, 45 degree, all the way, and then the pieces break out, and they tumble into the creek, which was meant to be here, but as I was mentioning earlier, these sections marked by seams that are joining them together, somehow they laid their concrete down so they could be joined. So presumably as one layer was cooling, as one section was cooling on the right, let's say, they would lay another section down the left, and it would be joined to some degree, somehow, to the section on the right. You know, it's obvious to us once we begin to realize that the Earth or the continents could have been built by advanced races, because advanced races exist, which is something that the universities didn't really consider for a long time. Then we can begin to notice the diagonal seams and say, oh, we can make sense of those, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't really notice that there was a pattern, because the way the ancients built is not the way we would build. We would do it differently. I've been here before, and these chunks had not come down, so this is clearly a bit dangerous, because we have this upper area, this upper layer that's a lot stronger. They always put the strongest layer on the top, and by the strongest layer on the top I mean that of the many layers above the first layer, it'll be the strongest layer. So that's pretty clear here, right? Because the river water, the creek water, has eroded significantly everything except that very top layer. But then we have to go, also it hasn't eroded the really strongest layer, which is the bottom layer. So I think the bottom layer is the strongest, then the top layer is the second strongest, and in between they have the alternating hard and soft layers. So we can get some kind of feel for that as we look at this panorama of layers. And interestingly, they use super thin layers reminiscent of the river that flows through the Bosnian pyramid complex here at the bottom of the structure. Interesting. Could that be for earthquake mitigation? Are the thinner layers the best for earthquake mitigation? We know that soft layers cushion, and the harder layers give structural support or structural shape, let's say. So the harder layers keep the soft layers in place, because if you just put soft layers, the hill would crumble. It would just sort of fall and be eroded out. But the hard layers keep the soft layers from fully eroding, and the soft layers help with earthquake mitigation. And we can see how this harder layer below the soft layer, which is really a lot of tiny little soft layers, but let's call that one layer, this harder layer then melts into another softer layer that the river water has eroded out, and then there's a super hard, what we call chert layer, and the geologists will say this is natural chert. But of course, once you realize that the diagonal seams, once we understand that the diagonal seams are artificial, then we can realize that the quote natural chert layer is simply another recipe of concrete that the ancients used. They said we need a super hard layer, not too thick, thin, that goes horizontally across, giving structural strength to what is in fact much softer chalky layers above and below. Pretty interesting. So they're all crystalline recipes, crystalline concrete recipes that the ancients mixed and heated as they created hills across continents. Now, I've been on 3 continents making archaeology videos, so I haven't been able to find any geology. It's always been built hills. So we came from there and we moved along, and here we come to a steep drop-off, which geologists would say is a natural erosive feature in natural material. But we know that the drop-off was in fact made by the ancients as part of their terraforming project. Now here's a little frog which I want to draw to your attention. See him? Hi, froggy. He doesn't care that it's terraformed concrete, and neither should you. Okay? I've wrestled with this issue. I personally don't care if it's natural or artificial. But we know it's artificial, and therefore my feeling is that the ancients who built this are not only benevolent, but incredibly benevolent, because they made these beautiful areas for instance, water drop-off, which creates negative ions. Any kind of turbulence in water creates negative ions, and those are really healthy. All those waterfalls you see in those adventure videos, National Geographic, and those 100-foot, 500-foot, 1,000-foot drop waterfalls, those are meant to be there. Those are not natural accidents, but were conceptualized, engineered, designed by a benevolent ancient race. So what we're seeing can be explained only by an artificial terraforming hypothesis. Geologists cannot explain what we see. And if we want to go with what we see and not with what we surmise, if we want to go with the data and not with belief, then we have to surrender to the idea that there were, and probably still are, races so much farther advanced than we are in engineering that built the continents, that created the hills and valleys and creek beds and river beds and mountains across the earth. This section next to the other section. It was just breaking apart at that somewhat weaker seam, right? Not a fracture. Not a fracture, it's just a broken apart seam in ancient concrete. And we can feel the building, right? We can see and feel the artificial nature of this concrete. Then we have three principal questions that remain. Who created continents across Terra, sculpting the land, creating hills and rivers and creeks and lakes? Why did they create such meticulously built, such highly engineered structures here in Texas out of concretized gypsum and what is known as chert? And finally, when was this terraforming accomplished? Let's continue our search for the truth about our past on mysterious Terra, with the understanding that the universities, although they did their best with their premise that there could be no race who wanted to build hills, rivers, valleys, mountains, lakes across the planet, were incorrect in their conclusions because their premise was false. Let's continue to probe Terra's mysteries and to find the best answers we can about humanity's past on Earth and about the past of all the races who have lived here, built here, warred here, destroyed here, and ultimately left a massive jigsaw puzzle legacy for us to put together, stone by stone, or we could say concrete section by concrete section. This is Jock Doubleday reporting from Gillespie County, Texas, July 7th, 2020. I hope you all have a scientific day.